So if the price of a good in a closed economy is lower than the world price, and that economy actually opens up for trade, the economy will tend to be a net exporter of that good. So let's actually see how that looks like. Okay. So suppose we actually have a country, so we have domestic demand, which is downward sloping, and we have domestic supply, which is always upward sloping. We have the equilibrium price, right, in this economy, right? So assuming the economy is basically a closed economy, the price of corn, right, in this market is just going to be P, and the quantity, equilibrium quantity, is just going to be Q, okay? Right, now if the world price is actually higher than the price of the closed economy, or the price of corn in the closed economy, what is going to happen is that when the country actually opens up for trade, since you actually have higher prices, there's going to be more supply, so producers are actually going to produce more. At the same time, you're going to have a decrease in quantity demanded, right? And the difference basically becomes your exports, okay? So the higher world price means producers will actually produce more and sell outside the country, okay? So producers and sellers will sell their goods outside the country or outside the United States. Corn farmers will produce more corn and will sell more corn in the world market because they can actually make a profit, okay? So in that sense, the exports will be the difference between KOS, which is basically the amount being supplied, which it goes up because they want to capitalize on higher prices, and QD, which will actually go down because the prices are expensive, okay? So every time you have a scenario where the world price, which I'll call WP, is greater than the price in the closed economy, or the domestic price, which I'll call CP, the country tends to be a net exporter. Right. So from this simple analysis using supply and demand, we can actually find winners and losers from trade. Okay, so the winners from trade, all right, using just our supply and demand perspective on trade, is consumers of imported goods. Why do consumers of imported goods benefit? Is because they take advantage of low prices. Okay, so remember, imports happen because world price is actually lower than the closed economy price. Okay, so lower prices. So consumers actually benefit from lower prices. Things are relatively cheaper to the consumer, just like us. Okay, and who also wins from trade is basically producers of exported prices. Why? Because they actually benefit from higher prices. Okay, so they can actually sell their goods for a profit. Okay, so producers benefit because they can sell their goods at a higher price and hence make profit. Now, who are the losers of trade? Well, it's consumers of exported goods. Why? Because they actually face higher prices and things are relatively more expensive. And there's not enough production as well. Okay, because majority of production is geared towards, trying to feed outside demand. And producers of imported goods also lose because they face lower prices and hence can't make much of a profit. Right, so earlier on I talked about how, you have these scholars, these economists who actually think that free trade is not necessarily good because you do have winners and you do have losers of free trade, right? And one particular thing you should actually take a look at, or you should make a note of, is producers of imported goods tend to suffer. Okay, so for example, United States, we actually import more than we export, right? So that has a lot of producers, okay? So producers of imported goods tend to suffer if there are not as much producers in the market. You don't have much production and the economy basically slows down. So you do have people who actually argue against free trade, right? And that actually brings us into this whole theory called protectionism, right? And protectionism basically says free trade is quite detrimental and in a way free trade should be restricted. And the main reason they say this is based on the fact that producers actually lose. Especially in the case of the country being a net importer like you have with the United States, okay? So they actually have these policies, or there are policies that are put in place, and we're going to take a look at those policies. That policies are actually put in place to sort of restrict free trade, and hence protect these producers, or protect infant industries or domestic producers, right? So we have the first one, which is basically a tariff, and you've probably heard of a tariff before, right? So a tariff is basically any tax imposed on an imported good. And then we have a quota. Okay, and a quota is the legal limit on the quantity of a good that may be imported, right? So they place a limit on how many goods should be imported, and that's a quota, right? So these are the two main tools used in trying to restrict free trade, and we basically use supply and demand to analyze these things on a market. Okay, so now let's look at the market for computers after the imposition of an import tariff. So suppose you have this market. Again, we have domestic supply. So we have this market for computers. We have the price of computers on our y-axis. We have the quantity of computers on our x-axis. We have domestic supply. We have domestic demand. Right? And we actually have the world price. So let's say this country is actually open up for trade. So we have the world price. Okay. So in the world price being lower than the closed economy price, which is given as P over here, you actually have domestic supply decreasing. So you have less producers in the market. And you actually have domestic demand increasing, okay? And hence you actually get this sort of artificial shortage in a way, right? So you have quantity demanded minus quantity supplied being your imports, okay? So QD minus QS basically is imports, right? This is before the tariff. Okay, so suppose these producers actually complain that, consumers are not buying goods from them anymore. And they want Uncle Sam to do something about it. They want the government to do something about it. So the government basically imposes a tariff on the world price, okay? So long as the government imposes a tariff on the world price becomes more expensive. Okay, so now you have the new world price, which includes a tariff at PT. Okay, and clearly you can see that quantity supplied has now in a way increased because of the tariff, and quantity demanded has actually decreased because of the tariff. So you now have new imports after the tariff, which is basically Q prime D minus Q prime S. Okay, so this has been a decrease in imports, and basically the tariff is doing its work. So imports have basically decreased. At the same time, there's going to be revenue collection, right? Because remember, the tariff is basically a tax, okay? So what is the revenue collection? Well, basically is the amount of tariff imposed times the amount of imports, okay? So the revenue equals the tariff imposed times imports. Okay, so that's the amount of revenue to the government. So basically the tariff actually does its job in the sense that it limits imports, as you can clearly see. Okay, so the world price becomes more expensive, quantity demanded decreases a little bit, quantity supplied increases, right? So the gap over here decreases, and now you have this smaller gap in comparison to this gap, right? So it does decrease the amount of imports. At the same time, it basically gives revenue to the government, okay? So those are the two advantages of actually having a tariff, right? And basically this is a graphical representation of it. And we can actually go deeper by looking at the algebra, okay? So with the algebra, I'm just going to go through it slowly, okay? So we have the market for computers in the United States, okay? We have quantity demanded equation, which is given by 3,000 minus 0.5 PC, where PC is basically the price of computers, right? And we have the quantity supplied equation, which is basically QS equals 1,000 plus 0.5 PC. The reason we have a negative sign over here is because demand is negatively sloping. So negatively sloped. And the reason we have a positive sign here is because supply is positively sloped. Okay. And from these two equations, so we have equation 1, we have equation 2. From these two equations, we can basically find equilibrium quantity and we can find equilibrium price as well, okay? So suppose we have the market for computers, we have these two equations. Suppose the market for computers in the United States, or suppose the United States economy is basically closed economy. We can actually find a closed economy price. And to find that, we actually have to equate supply and demand. Okay, so this is our supply equation. Remember, equilibrium is the point where supply equals demand. And this is our demand equation, right? So equating them and solving for PC, we find out PC is basically $2,000. Okay, so this is the closed economy price. And we can find the equilibrium quantity. All we have to do is plug this 2,000 into either one of these equations. Okay, so we chose this equation, right? So then we have 1,000 plus 0.5 times 2,000 equals 2,000 computers, okay? So the price of a computer in this closed economy is going to be $2,000, and the amount of computers going to be produced is 2,000 computers, okay? Now, suppose this country actually opens its borders for trade, okay? And we're given the fact that the world price is $1,400, okay? So the world price for the same computer is $1,400. Well, there'll be a shift, okay? So given the world price, we need to find what will happen to quantity supplied, and we need to find out what will happen to quantity demanded, okay? So we use the same equation, but instead of plugging 2,000 like we did before for price, we plug in 1,400 because that's the new world price, okay? So quantity demanded is going to be, quantity supplied is going to be 1,000 plus 0.5 times 1,400, and you should get 1,700. Okay, so that's the quantity supplied in the economy. And then quantity demanded is going to be 3,000 minus 0.5 times 1,400, which is 2,300. And the difference is going to be the imports. Okay, so the difference is 2,300 minus 1,700. And essentially those are going to be the imports, okay? That's the amounts people are actually going to import from the rest of the world or from outside the country, okay? So they're going to import 600 computers, okay? So clearly, even without going through these whole calculations, we can clearly see that a country will be a net importer. Why? Because the world price is essentially less than the closed economy price, which was 2,000. Okay, well, suppose producers come to the government and complain that people are not buying as much. As we can clearly see, quantity supply basically decreases to 1,700, right? And the government decides to impose a tariff. Okay, so they impose a tariff of $400 per computer. Okay, So in that sense, the world price of a computer will increase by $400. So we have $1,400, which is the world price of the computer, plus $100. And we have $1,800. Okay. So now using the same steps, we try and find quantity supplied at the world price. And it's going to be 1,000 plus 0.5 times 1,800, and we have 1,900. Okay, so production actually increases just a little bit. But what happens to demand? Okay, so we have 3,000 minus, so this is supposed to be minus 0.5 times 1,800, and we have 2,100. Okay, so demand actually decreases because it's relatively more expensive now. And our inputs is again quantity demanded minus quantity supplied. So we have 2,100 minus 1,900 and 200. Okay, so our inputs actually decrease from 600. So initially our inputs without a tariff was 600. And now our imports with a tariff is 200. Okay, so the government has been able to actually decrease imports to 200. And the government is also able to actually gain revenue from this tariff. Okay, so now tariff revenue is basically going to be $400, because remember it's $400 per computer times 200 computers which are basically being imported, and the government gains revenue of $80,000. Okay, so that is the math behind it. Basically that's the math behind it. Okay, the next thing we'll look at is basically the effects of an import quota. Okay, so we still have our simple equation. So we have quantity supplied equaling 1,000 plus 0.5 times PC, which is the price of a computer, right? And suppose the government comes in and says there should be an import of only 200 computers. So basically there's a quota, right? So you limit the amount of imports. So we're limiting the amount of imports to only 200 computers. Okay, so the total quantity of computers supplied is going to be given by the equation QS, which is quantity supplied. Okay, so this is going to be domestic supply of computers, which is basically 1,000 plus 0.5 PC, plus the extra 200 computers which are being allowed to be imported into the country. Okay, so we add this 200 essentially to our equation. So then we have 1,200 plus 0.5 PC, and nothing really happens to our demand equation. It still stays the same. Okay, so remember that the quota basically is adding to domestic supply. Okay, so the government has given a license out, or has given people the right to basically import only 200 computers. Okay, so that is going to be added to our supply equation. Okay, again, we can find a new equilibrium. Okay, so it's going to be 1,200 plus 0.5 PC, which is basically quantity supplied, should equal quantity demanded, which is 3,000 minus 0.5 PC, and from there we can get the equilibrium price, which is $1,800. Okay, so with the imposition of the quota, right, equilibrium price is slightly higher than before. Okay, in terms of the world price, right? And based on this, we can actually find, so we now know the new equilibrium price. Based on this, we can actually find the domestic quantity supplied. Okay, so domestic quantity supplied, all we have to do is put the new price, which is $1,800, into domestic quantity supplied equation. So it was 1,000 plus 0.5 P. So that's going to be 1,000 plus 0.5 times 1,800. And you get 1,900 computers. Okay, and domestic quantity demanded is putting the $1,800, which is the new equilibrium price you found, into the quantity demanded equation, and it's going to be 3,000 minus 0.5 times 1,800, which is basically going to be 2,100. Again, quantity demanded does not equal quantity supply, so you still have some imports, which you already know is 200. And the government can basically get revenue from these 200 computers imported in terms of the quota, right? So it's 200 times 1800, right, which is basically the new price, minus 1500, which was the old price, okay, times 200, and you get $60,000, okay? So the government basically gets $60,000 in form of revenue from imposition of the quota.